The cold, heavy air pressed down on his tiny lungs. The first thing he felt wasn't the gentle light, but the dull smell of damp earth, rotted leaves, and stale concrete. He tumbled out, a tiny, wet thing. His mother, a feral cat with a torn ear and old scars along her sides, nudged him toward her warm flank. Their den was a niche in the partially ruined foundation of an old abandoned utility box, heavily overgrown with thorny bushes. A massive concrete slab loomed overhead, offering a false sense of protection from the sky. This spot, on the back lot of a storage facility, reeked of solitude and survival. He was the third in the litter. The first, a gray kitten, gently snuffled at his mother's belly. The second, black and white, was already actively nursing. But he, the ginger one, squirmed, shook his head, and instinctively sought the source of warmth and life. His newborn world was absolute darkness, broken only by a faint, rare light filtering through the tangled branches. A constant low hum drifted around them, the life of the big city, breathing right above them, oblivious to their existence. His fur hadn't dried yet. He trembled with small, frequent shivers, his only goal to press against that soft, familiar body. Thus began his journey, a path without a name, in a world that wouldn't wait for him. He grew fast, and the world around him became increasingly menacing. Now the scent of earth was overridden by the sharp metallic aroma of gasoline and motor oil that wafted from the nearest storage units. The sounds had changed. It was no longer a hum, but the clang of padlocks, the whine of a power drill, and the choppy voices of men. The ginger, like the rest of his family, lived by a strict schedule: dawn, the time his mother left to hunt, and the deep night, the most dangerous hours when noisy groups gathered in the complex. After 5 weeks, he ventured outside for the first time. The roots of the bushes snagged his fur. Concrete grit scraped the pads of his paws. The world unfolded. Huge, gray storage units stretched in a seemingly endless row, framing a narrow passage littered with old tires and lumber. He pressed himself against the rough, moss-covered foundation wall, feeling its dampness and chill. This was his first introduction to the outside world. His mother appeared with a small piece of hot dog in her jaws. Seeing him so far from the shelter, she let out a short, demanding sound, a low, guttural meow that meant, "Back, now." The ginger, not fully grasping the danger, quickly scrambled back into his concrete nest. That same day, he saw people up close for the first time. A man in his 30s, wearing stained overalls, stepped out of a unit. He paused to light a cigarette and instantly noticed the movement. "Hey, Ginger, still lurking around, you pest!" he yelled in a loud, slightly annoyed voice, flicking his cigarette butt toward their spot. The ginger, who was hiding behind a thick root, didn't flinch. He didn't know the words were directed at him, as he had no name. He was just the ginger. He only registered the sharp feeling of threat, mixed with the smell of tobacco. "Go on, get out of here," the man grumbled, scuffing his shoes on the gravel, and went back inside the unit, slamming the door. His mother came over and nudged his side with her nose, as if to say, "Avoid them." The ginger, breathing heavily, stared at the closed door. He understood that people brought danger, but also the potential for food, which his mother constantly brought from the invisible world. The main thing was to stay in the shadows. His life depended on the speed with which he could disappear if anything went wrong. The family stayed near the utility box for 3 more weeks. Then came the time when people decided their shelter was no longer useful. It wasn't the sound of an accident, but a low building rumble that was felt more than heard. It was just past 7 in the morning. Two men in bright safety vests approached the abandoned box. One carried a crowbar, the other a heavy sledgehammer. "All right, let's knock this trash down while the owner's gone, huh?" the man with the hammer asked curtly, without even looking at the thicket. "It's taking up too much space," the second replied, wedging the crowbar into a crack in the old foundation. The ginger, who had been sitting in safety just moments before, felt the ground under his paws begin to tremble as their refuge, their only protection, suddenly shifted. The sound of the crowbar biting into the concrete was sharp and terrifying. The black-and-white kitten squeaked in fear, not understanding what was happening. Fear became physical. His tongue felt dry. His chest tightened so much he couldn't draw a breath. He saw chunks of plaster and dust flying toward him. His legs, paralyzed by horror for a second, suddenly found strength. He bolted, not thinking, not aiming, just away from the sound. He squeezed under a prickly hawthorn bush, catching on the branches, just as a dull, dreadful blow from the sledgehammer echoed behind him. The concrete slab over their heads crashed down with a splintering sound. "Get it again!" the men shouted. The sound of crumbling stone drowned out all others. His body was sticky with sweat and dust. The noise slowly subsided. The ginger, trembling, crawled out from under the bush. Everything was empty. No mother, no siblings. Only the torn-up foundation, concrete pieces, sticking out branches, and a sharp, sour smell of dust. He sat alone on the cold, rough gravel. The cold bit his paw pads. It became obvious. The world, once shared by several bodies, was now only his. He was tiny, helpless, but alive. Then he heard a thin, barely audible peep. Not his, it was his brother. The sound came from under a neighboring fallen garage door. The ginger crept toward it, not daring to move into the open without his mother nearby. He found him small and shaking. They pressed against each other, sharing what little warmth they had. It was in that moment, in the darkness, amidst the smell of concrete and dampness, that the ginger realized his new status. Now he was completely feral, wild, no longer part of a family, but simply one of the countless, nameless ginger shadows that live in the urban jungle. He lifted his head, looked at the dark, indifferent sky above. He had to search for food and a new shelter, a new kingdom. "Careful, don't spill that. I told you, cats don't belong here." "Oh, come on, Ms. Carroll, they're quiet. Look how ginger that one is." A tall young guy in a uniform crouched down, holding a cardboard bowl with the remains of beef stew. A full-figured woman with large working hands stood in the doorway of the cafe's back kitchen. Her face showed a mix of exhaustion and slight annoyance. "Quiet, sure, and then they get into the flour bags, and it takes a week to get them out. Stop this, Max. The boss will see, and I'll catch hell." "No one will see. It's dark right now." Max cautiously placed the bowl by a concrete ledge where the lamplight rarely fell. "Eat up, little ginger." The ginger, who was hiding behind a drainpipe with his brother, stretched his neck. A strong, hot smell of meat, spices, and something unfamiliar yet terribly appealing came from the bowl. It was the first warm food they'd seen in 2 days. Yesterday they had only found a piece of wet bread crust. "Well, you fed him, that's enough. Pick up the bowl and get back to work, and don't call him little ginger, Max. They're all ginger, gray, and white out here. They don't have names. Don't anthropomorphize." The woman's voice was firm, but without real malice. She was already turning to leave. After their mother disappeared and their first home was destroyed, the ginger and his brother were forced to move. Instinct led them to the only known source of a constant food scent, the back lot of a bistro on the very street where they were born. Here, in the labyrinth of narrow passageways between the restaurant wall and the utility blocks, lived a colony. The colony was ruled by an old, powerful tomcat named Regal. His nostril was torn, and he always made a rasping sound, as if he were running out of air. The ginger, Nameless, was at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Any attempt to get close to the fresh bowl that Max or other employees put out was met with a snarl, or sometimes a cuff from a heavy paw. The ginger's brother, weak and constantly trembling, didn't last 2 weeks in that hell. One morning, the ginger didn't find him. Only a faint spot of blood near a rusty grate. From that day on, the ginger survived alone. His world narrowed to 3 things: hunger, cold, and fear. Fear came from Regal, from the screech of tires, from the steps of people, from the icy autumn wind that pierced his thin fur. Today, he was quick enough. When Max left and Ms. Carroll closed the door, the ginger darted toward the bowl, but he wasn't alone. "Back off, runt!" Regal hissed, materializing from the shadows of the wall. "That's mine." Regal stood over the bowl, the fur on his neck raised. The ginger felt his own ears press back against his head and the muscles in his hind legs tense, ready to spring or flee. He was so hungry his stomach was cramping. "What are you staring at? Go, I said." Regal didn't want to waste energy fighting a kitten. A mere demonstration of power was enough. The ginger made a mistake. He didn't leave. He tried to slip around the side to grab at least a small piece. In that same second, Regal struck, not with claws, but with the full force of his heavy paw. The blow hit the ginger's head from the side. He was thrown into the wall. The impact was sharp. The world flipped. For a second, the ginger only saw stars, even though the night was absolutely starless. He landed on his side, feeling a sharp pain pierce his ribs and echo as a dull wave in his temple. His breath hitched. He couldn't inhale. His mouth opened, but no air came in. It was like drowning, only in dust and darkness. He instinctively pressed himself against the gravel. Regal didn't move from his spot. He simply watched, slowly and deliberately finishing the beef stew. For him, this was routine, a confirmation of his status. "That's it. Remember," Regal rasped between bites of meat. The pain in his ribs became sharp and throbbing. When he finally managed the first ragged breath, he tasted the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. He lay, not daring to move, until he heard a familiar sound. "God, these fights again." It was Max, who had come out to throw away a trash bag. Max noticed the ginger pressed against the wall, and Regal, who immediately retreated into the shadows. The young man bent down. The ginger, gathering the last of his strength, tried to crawl away, but his body wouldn't obey. "Hey, Ginger, you got hit again?" Max didn't try to pet him. He just looked intently. His face showed a brief, fleeting compassion, which quickly gave way to fatigue. Max sighed and straightened up. He took the empty bowl that Regal had licked clean and tossed the bag into the dumpster. The sound was dull and final. The human didn't intervene, didn't save or punish. He simply left, closing the door behind him. Loneliness descended upon the ginger like a heavy slab, like the one that had crushed their old home. He slowly rose, swaying, and limped toward an old rainwater drain. It was quiet there, and it didn't smell of Regal. He licked his broken lip. Every new scratch, every new bruise made him wilder, more cautious. He wasn't a little ginger, a pest, or a runt. He was simply a mechanism for survival with a set of instincts allowing him to make it to the next meal, the next night, the next scuffle. The name people tossed at him casually meant nothing, because in this world it offered neither protection nor a right to live. The night was cold. The ginger curled up, squeezed to his limit. Tomorrow he would have to get up and fight for a gulp of life again. Fullness was a foolish, dangerous, soft stupidity that clouded the sharpness of his senses. When his stomach wasn't cramping with hunger, the ginger began to feel other, subtler things: the cold that seeped into his bones, the dull ache of an old bruise on his right flank, the scent of approaching rain, and, most importantly, the feeling of strange, incomprehensible movement in the surrounding space. He was almost a year old. He had become strong, sinewy. In scuffles with other cats, he learned not to win, but to survive, to escape with minimal losses. His world consisted of shadows, smells, and rhythms. People were part of that rhythm: the thud of their steps, their sudden empty shouts, their strange habit of leaving food and then immediately forgetting about it. Every human was an unpredictable force of nature that had to be avoided. Since his mother and siblings disappeared, absolute invisibility was the only constant, the only way to stay whole. And now this feeling. It was new. It didn't smell like a threat, like Regal. It didn't smell like indifference, like Max. It smelled too clean, too slow. They were approaching, 2 people. The ginger lay on the roof of a low shed behind the storage units. From here, under the dense tangle of old grapevines, he had a perfect vantage point. He could see the narrow passage to the bistro and hear the bark of a shepherd dog from the neighboring yard. It was early evening, the sun had already touched the tops of the buildings, and the light was a thick orange. He felt tension spread down his spine. 2 people, a woman and a man. The woman was about 30, wearing a simple but clean-down jacket. She was carrying a large, strange bag. The man was older, slender, with a neat beard. They weren't moving like passers-by or storage clients. They were moving with purpose. "We didn't see him here yesterday?" the man asked softly, almost whispering, scanning the hawthorn thicket. "No, not here. He was closer to the dumpster yesterday." The woman crouched down, placing her bag on the ground. She smelled of laundry detergent and something medicinal, a clean, unnatural scent. "Ethan, are you sure we should try to catch him? He's completely feral. Remember how he hissed yesterday?" "I'm sure. If we don't get him now, he won't survive the winter," Ethan replied. His voice was soft but firm. "He looks like he has an old wound on his right side, and he's coughing." The ginger, hearing his side mentioned, froze. How did they know? He almost never coughed around people. He crept off the shed and squeezed under a pile of rough wooden crates. From there, he watched the woman open the bag. It wasn't a bag, but a metal mesh carrier, like the one he'd once seen a captured rat in. "I'll put it here near the drain. This is where he usually eats." The woman pulled a dish from a bag. Not leftover stew, but soft, moist, very expensive-smelling canned food. The scent was so strong that the instinct he fought so hard to suppress suddenly screamed, "Food!" They stepped away, but they didn't leave. They hid behind the corner of the unit. The ginger felt their presence, but hunger overpowered even fear. He waited 10 minutes, 15. His body ached from staying motionless. The aroma of the food overshadowed the smell of gasoline and dust. He had to eat. He gave in, hunger. The ginger slipped out from under the crates, keeping low to the ground. Every step was slow, measured. His whiskers twitched nervously, catching the slightest disturbance in the air. The carrier was open at one end. Inside, a bowl of food, a lure. He slipped inside. The food was incredibly tender, melting on his tongue. 1,000 times better than old sausage or raw chicken skin. He ate, pressing his whole body against the bowl, trying to swallow as much as possible in 1 second. It was in that moment that he felt the change in the air. Not a smell, not a sound, but a spatial pressure, a heaviness. He lifted his head. The wooden door behind him slammed shut with a clang. The sound cut off his path to salvation. The world tilted again. The physical fear was absolute. His heart began to pound so hard he felt like it would burst through his chest. Saliva instantly dried up. He was plunged into a wild, blind panic. He began to thrash. The metal of the carrier cut his fur. He clawed at the mesh, trying to find a way out, but the sharp edges only slipped. He hissed. He growled. His voice was piercing, unfamiliar even to himself. He hurled himself at the front bars, hit his head, and recoiled. The strange, unfamiliar scents and the confined space pressed in. It was the worst sensation, the inability to run. Ethan and the woman immediately stepped out from around the corner. "Easy, easy, it's okay," she whispered. But to the ginger, her whisper sounded like a loud, mocking sound. He saw her face through the mesh, distorted by an expression of pity. But pity was empty to the ginger. It was just another human scent, irrelevant to reality. Reality was the metal bars, locking away his will. The woman slowly draped a thick, dark blanket over the carrier. The world plunged into darkness again, but now it was not the life-saving, familiar darkness of a hiding spot, but the suffocating, oppressive blackness of a trap. He heard Ethan and the woman discussing him. He didn't understand the words, only the tone. It was too calm. "He's so wild," the woman said. "It's no surprise. A year on the street. The main thing is, we've caught him," Ethan replied. The ginger, now unable to thrash, lay pressed against the cold metal. The carrier was lifted. He felt his body separate from the ground, from the familiar smell of dirt and gas. He had become an object, cargo. The name they called him, Ginger, now sounded not like a description of his color, but like an inventory number. He was caught. He was a found stray who had nothing but fear. First, it was a smell, sharp, insistent, unlike anything else. It overwhelmed the familiar aromas of gasoline, dust, and decay. This scent was composed of many layers. A faint metallic tang, a distinct smell of disinfectant, overlaid by the cloyingly suffocating smell of excrement and the sour, warm aroma of boiled meat. And everywhere the smell of fear, not his personal fear, but a collective fear that hung in the air like a heavy curtain. The ginger, still wrapped in the dark blanket, was unloaded from the car. The carrier was placed on a hard, cold linoleum floor. All around, a continuous, multi-voiced chorus rose. Soft meows, demanding howls, low growls, and a solitary, piercing yowl. The touch on the carrier changed. Now, it wasn't the soft, careful hands of volunteers, but stiff, professional fingers. The fabric was yanked away. Bright, merciless fluorescent light hit his eyes. He was in a long, noisy corridor. On both sides, rows of cages stretched all the way to the ceiling. In each, someone's fate, someone's pain, someone's fear. They were all here, looking at him silently and mournfully. The ginger retreated to the far corner of his mesh prison, ready for any attack. He was quickly moved. A woman in a white lab coat with tired eyes quickly examined him through the bars. She spoke calmly, dictating something into a small recorder. Cat, approximately 1 year old, unneutered ginger coloring. Fur is thick but heavily soiled, excessively aggressive, old healed scar on the right flank, likely a fight wound. She didn't call him Ginger, like Max. She didn't call him a pest, like the storage worker. She gave him a series of neutral, impersonal descriptions. And this was even scarier than anger. Anger gave him a target to fight. Indifference gave him nothing. Record him as Street Ginger. Cage number 53, quarantine, and please, be careful with him. He was pulled from the carrier with rough but skilled movements, wrapped in a thick towel so he couldn't scratch. He didn't know what was happening, but instinct screamed, "Resist!" He arched his back, biting blindly. Strange skin, strange hands, strange will. "Easy, Ginger, calm down." It was the voice of the same woman who had helped catch him. She was now in a lab coat and gloves. They held him tightly as they gave him a shot. He felt a sharp, instantaneous prick, and then a strong burning sensation. It was humiliating. The body he had worked so hard to defend was completely under the control of these huge, medical-smelling beings. When they released him into the new cage, he immediately hid under the bedding. "He's feral, of course. He'll go through the street cat program," the woman in the coat said, checking the lock. "Yeah, Stella," replied the young man who had carried him. "It's a shame. He's a beautiful cat, but who would take one like that? He'd bite anyone." All they gave him was a bowl of water and a litter box. He was in a steel cage, number 53. His world was now confined to a 1-square-yard space. He sat, waiting, listening for sounds that might remind him of freedom, but there was only the barking and meowing of hundreds of other prisoners, and the name, Street Ginger. He sat there, hunched over, for 3 hours. A dull, aching pain from the shot was growing in his body. But this physical pain was nothing compared to what was happening inside. There was no open air, no familiar scent, only steel. Suddenly, a new figure appeared in the corridor. A woman in a uniform rolled a cart. Cans of food sat on it. The sound, the tinny clang with which she placed the metal bowls in other cages, was almost unbearable. The woman approached cage number 52, directly opposite the Gingers, and easily, habitually, laid out a portion. The cat in cage 52, a gray one with huge, sad eyes, immediately began to eat. The woman moved to the Ginger, to cage number 53. She stopped. Her tired gaze slid over his compressed body. For a moment, something flickered on her face. Not pity, but perhaps exhaustion from the constant, hopeless cycle. They catch them, feed them, try to place them, but most remain. She forcefully set his bowl down. The metal banged against the bars. The Ginger felt the sound shake his whole body, from tail to ear tips. It was an invasion. In fear, he hissed, lunging at the bars. The woman immediately flinched, her lips twisting. "Oh, you savage!" she gasped, stepping back. "Well, that's what you get. Sit here now." The Ginger, breathing heavily, looked at her through the bars. He felt the tension in him reach its peak, the dryness in his mouth becoming unbearable. Was this a victory? No. It was confirmation. He was an outsider here. The woman quickly finished her rounds and left, leaving behind only the clatter of the retreating cart. The Ginger remained lying down. His breathing was uneven. His heart continued to beat wildly. The food lay untouched in the bowl. Hunger was there, but the instinct for self-preservation, the fierce aversion to the imposed space, was stronger. He wouldn't eat under their surveillance. He looked at the gray cat in cage 52. That cat ate calmly, occasionally glancing at the Ginger. This cat had apparently given up long ago. He accepted their rules. He accepted this place. The Ginger wasn't going to accept anything. He would fight for his solitude and freedom even in this steel box. Here, they couldn't reach him, couldn't hit him. He was safe, but he wasn't free, and he wasn't anyone. Street Ginger, a cat without a name, waiting to be released back into the world he knew. A world where it was dangerous, but at least he could run. If life used to be measured by smells, decay, gasoline, fried onions, now it was measured by hours. There was a constant readiness to bolt, tension, the absolute rule of his own instinct. Now it was four walls, mesh and concrete, where every sound, every movement, even the beating of his own heart, seemed to echo. 2 weeks passed. The Ginger, the Street Ginger, still hadn't let anyone near him. He ate only at night, when the corridor was quiet and no one could witness his humiliation. The worst part was the lack of horizon. On the street, you could always see the edge of a building, the corner of a fence, offering hope for a new hiding spot. Here, there was only a gray corridor filled with rows of unfamiliar cages. His wildness, which had been the guarantee of his survival, had turned into his personal prison in these conditions. He sat, pressed into the bedding, his gaze averted. He didn't want to see, didn't want to hear. He wanted to become part of the wall. But even in the shelter, the rhythm of life changed. On Wednesdays at noon, they came. Noisy, bright, clumsy high school students. The visits by student volunteers were part of the socialization program. The teenagers came to wash dishes, change litter, and, worst of all for the Ginger, try to play with the cats. These visits were the peak of intrusion. Today was no exception. High-pitched, broken voices echoed down the corridor. Laughter. The Ginger felt his back tense. He waited for the clang, the shouts, the attempts to stick fingers through the bars. "Don't touch that cage," he heard the clipped voice of Stella, the woman in the white coat. "Number 53. That's our Savage, a street cat. He won't get adopted easily. He just gets stressed. Leave him alone." The words Savage and Street became the Ginger's unofficial name, his brand. The group moved down the corridor, the scraping of bowls, quiet conversations. The Ginger didn't look, but he felt the shadow that fell over his cage for a moment, then retreated. The cage opposite, number 52, where the compliant gray cat sat, came alive. "Look how he's playing," someone exclaimed. "Yeah, he's sweet," a girl replied. "But why are his eyes so sad?" And then something the Ginger hadn't expected happened. One person stopped at his cage. It was a boy, maybe 14 or 15, in a baggy hoodie that was clearly too big for him. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there. The Ginger, breaking his own rule, slowly turned his head. He expected a provocation, a rap on the bars, a teasing finger, but nothing happened. The boy stood 5 feet from the cage, not looking directly at the cat. He was looking at the floor, as if deep in thought. "Tough spot, huh?" the boy said very quietly, almost a whisper. He wasn't talking to the cat. He seemed to be talking to himself. The Ginger felt his whiskers twitch, not from fear, but from confusion. No shouting, no banging, just this quiet, steady, young voice that cut through the general noise. The boy slowly, with maximal caution, knelt down. He held a small, crumpled bag in his hand. Not cat food, it was a piece of dried fish, which smelled of salty sea and comfort. The smell was unfamiliar, but not threatening. The boy extended his hand toward the cage, but not all the way, leaving it about 8 inches from the bars. The palm was open, motionless. The Ginger, used to hands always bringing either pain or confinement, tensed to the limit. He felt the skin on his back begin to itch from nervous strain. Inside him, two instincts fought: the fierce desire to grab the food and the absolute shuddering fear of the strange hand. The boy didn't move. His gaze was focused, but not on the ginger, it was on his own hand. He waited 5 seconds, 10. "I get it. You don't know who I am." The boy's voice was still low and calm. He spoke slowly, with pauses, as if he knew every word had to be carefully considered. "I'm just here. You want to eat? If not, that's fine." When the boy received no reaction, he slowly, without any sudden movements, placed the piece of fish right in front of the bars. Then, just as slowly, he withdrew his hand and stood up. He looked at the ginger, and in his eyes there was no pity or irritation, only a quiet, sad statement of fact. The boy simply turned and walked away to the rest of the group. The ginger sat, a nervous tremor ringing through his body. This was no blow, no shout. It was something new, incomprehensible, a gift without a demand. He felt his heart beating heavily, raggedly, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't from fear, but from confusion. The piece of fish lay right in front of his nose, too close to people, too far from safety. The ginger didn't touch it, but he didn't look away either. After the students left, the corridor emptied and filled with the familiar sense of disinfectant and communal sorrow. The ginger continued to stare at the fish. It was important for him to understand what this was, a trap, or simply a strange, illogical action that didn't fit into his street-forged view of the world. He spent the rest of the evening looking at that small piece of dried meat. At night, when all the lights were off and silence fell, he finally crawled out from under the bedding. He approached the bars. The food was there, untouched. He cautiously licked the rough surface of the fish with the tip of his tongue. Salt. Sea. At dawn, the ginger discovered that the piece of fish had vanished while he slept. One of the neighbors had been faster. But the main thing wasn't that. The main thing was that the boy would come again. The ginger didn't know why, but he knew for sure. And for the first time in a long time, he was waiting not for nightfall, but for the arrival of the next Wednesday. The corner of cage number 53 was the quietest spot in the shelter corridor. Kitchen smells didn't reach here, and the lamps shone a little dimmer, but it was also the coldest spot. The metal floor and walls seemed to leach any warmth from his body, even through the thin bedding. However, it was here, in the shadows and the cold, that the ginger found his new routine. He lay curled up in a tight ball and stared at the spot where the boy always appeared on Wednesdays. The concrete floor in front of his cage was clean, but to the ginger it bore the imprint of a presence. Every time the boy came, this square of space, 5 feet from the bars, became the center of his world. The ginger knew that on Wednesday at noon, silence would arrive. Silence, broken only by a steady, gentle voice. This place, this section of the floor, ceased to be just a corridor. It was a kind of invisible safe circle that the boy had drawn with his presence. Another week passed. The ginger waited. The waiting was slow, but not exhausting. It gave a point of reference to his nameless existence. The boy arrived exactly on time. At 12 Hunquak, while the rest of the students went to clean litter boxes in another section, the boy in the baggy hoodie appeared in the corridor. He stopped at cage number 53. "Hello, Ginger," he said, using the defining name he had heard from other people. The ginger, who was lying pressed against the wall, didn't move, but his breathing became ragged. The boy crouched down, just like last time. He didn't look directly at the cat. His gaze was directed slightly lower. In his hand, He again held a small bag. "I brought some chicken today," the boy said, unwrapping the parchment. "It doesn't smell as strong as the fish. You should eat." He placed a small, warm piece of meat on the same square of floor. Then, instead of leaving immediately, he stayed sitting. He took earbuds from his pocket, put them on, but didn't turn the music up loud. He just sat. His presence was calm, almost silent. A minute passed. 2. The ginger felt the intense desire to eat the chicken, fighting with the instinct not to let a strange hand near him. "I'll just read a bit here," the boy said quietly, pulling out a small, worn book. He spoke as if he wasn't addressing a wild animal, but an old, grumpy friend. For the first time in his life, the ginger understood. This human is not an enemy. He hadn't tried to grab him, hadn't tried to scare him, hadn't laughed at him. He was offering safety in his presence. The lack of direct eye contact, the low, steady voice, all of it was unlike the aggression the ginger was used to. He slowly, with difficulty, stretched his neck out from under the bedding, took a step, froze, another step. The stone grit still stuck in his fur from the street pricked his skin, reminding him of the past. But the smell of chicken lured him forward. The boy was reading. Only the tip of his ear was visible beneath his hair. The ginger made a decision. Crawling, almost hugging the floor, he crept to the bars. The distance between him and the hand that had placed the food was critically small. He stopped. His eyes were wide. His pupils were like vertical slits. His breathing was fast and shallow. Every muscle in his body was humming with tension. He felt the tips of his whiskers barely touching the bars of the cage. He looked at the boy's hand, holding the book. It was clean, young. It smelled of neither pain, nor medicine, nor decay. The boy sensed his closeness, but didn't make the slightest movement. He didn't lower the book, didn't look up. He simply waited. The ginger, overcoming himself, stretched out his front paw and gently, barely touching, tapped the bar of the cage. He felt the cold of the metal, but it was his own, familiar cold. And then the boy spoke, without looking up from the book, very quietly, almost a whisper. "It's just you. I know you're hungry." In that moment, the ginger understood there was no trick. The open space between the bars where he could have slipped his paw remained untouched. No one was trying to grab him. This was the greatest trust he had ever witnessed. He snatched the chicken and immediately retreated, chewing it at incredible speed. The taste of the meat was overwhelming. But far more important was that he took it in the presence of the person who had granted him that right. When he finished, he looked at the boy. His heart stopped beating in panic. It just pounded, echoing in his ears. The boy, having finished the page, neatly closed the book. He looked at the empty square of floor in front of the cage, then shifted his gaze to the ginger. "Good job. See, I told you. Nothing scary." He got up from the floor, his joints cracked from sitting so long on the concrete. He didn't take the bowl, he just smiled, a soft, slightly embarrassed smile. He didn't try to call him Little Ginger or Street Cat. He seemed to understand that words were irrelevant to this animal right now. The boy went back to the group. The ginger watched him until the baggy hoodie disappeared around the bend. This was the first meal he had eaten, not in fear, but in a state close to acceptance. He knew this boy would return. His calmness had become the new single constant. The ginger leaned against the wall. The taste of chicken was still delicious on his tongue, and his stomach was warm. But the main feeling was that he, the nameless wild cat, was not alone during mealtime for the first time in his life. After playing with a string toy, Owen slowly got up and approached Stella, who was filling out paperwork at the end of the corridor. "Excuse me, Stella," he said, lowering his voice, using the respectful tone adopted by the student volunteers. "It's been 2 months since I started working with him. He doesn't hiss, and he lets me reach my hand through the bars. Can I? I want to try petting him without the bars. I'll open the cage, but I'll stay outside." Stella, tired, looked at him over her glasses. She remembered how wildly Barrack, the former street ginger, had thrashed in the carrier. She had seen how he settled by the bars in Owen's presence. "Are you crazy, Owen? He'll slice you open," she said softly. "He won't slice me open. Look." Owen nodded toward the cage, where Barrack sat with a relaxed tail, looking toward the door. "He's ready. I can feel it. If anything goes wrong, I'll slam it shut right away." Stella sighed heavily. She knew this cat wouldn't survive if he remained feral, and Owen was his only chance. "Fine, Owen. Open it, and keep the door pulled close." Owen returned. Barrack sensed the change in his behavior and tensed up, but he didn't run. The boy slowly, with maximum caution, opened the cage. He did it deliberately, warning him with his movement. Barrack instantly became rigid. The instinct to flee was strong, but the curiosity and trust accumulated over the months outweighed it. Owen didn't crawl inside. He simply opened the door and once again settled on the floor next to the cage. "You can come out. I won't hold you. It's your choice," he said. The door was open. Barrack saw his chance. Freedom. But all around were unfamiliar smells, unfamiliar cats, unfamiliar people. He looked at the open doorway, at the cold, gray corridor. He didn't leave. Instead, he slowly, unhurriedly, approached Owen. Not the exit, but the human. He pressed his head against the bars, right next to the boy's hand. Owen cautiously, incredibly slowly, slid his palm into the opening and placed it on Barrack's head. The touch was warm, safe, and unexpectedly heavy. Barrack felt his body relax for the first time in his entire life. For a second, he even closed his eyes, and in that moment, in that silence, Owen spoke. You have to have a name, not just Ginger, right?" The boy lightly scratched him behind the ear, right where his feral mother had a torn piece of cartilage. "You're going to be Barrack." At that sound, the cat felt the name, Barrack, enter him like warmth, like recognition. He was no longer a street cat. He was Barrack. Barrack, hearing his name for the first time in his life, did what he had never done. He lifted his front paws and hugged Owen's wrist, pressing his cheek against his arm. It was an instinctive, childlike movement. Owen didn't pull his arm away. He only held the cat tighter. "Yes, Barrack. My Barrack." Stella walked past the mesh. She stopped. Seeing the scene where the wild, unloved ginger cat was embracing the teenager, she couldn't hide her astonishment. "Wow, Owen," she breathed out. "I thought he'd stay feral forever." "He was just waiting for his name," Owen replied, never taking his eyes off Barrack. The name was given. It wasn't an inventory number, it was an act of personal recognition. It was a symbol of a new life, in which Barrack, for the first time, wasn't just Ginger, but someone. Barrack was sleeping. It wasn't the anxious, light sleep of a street animal that wakes at every rustle. It was a deep, warm sleep in which his body finally allowed itself to relax. He slept on the soft fleece bedding that Owen had brought specially for him. In his sleep, he felt his name, Barrack. This sound became part of his inner silence. The unexpected event happened at 4 o'clock a.m. A deafening, piercing yowl echoed through the shelter corridor. It wasn't the barking of dogs, nor a cat fight. It was a pure, unadulterated scream of terror that bounced off the concrete walls and sliced through the silence like glass. Barak instantly woke up. He didn't just jump, he was thrown into the air. In a single moment, his body reverted to its wild state. Muscles tensed, the fur on his neck stood up, and a low, warning growl caught in his throat. Instinct screamed, "Danger! Run!" He lunged into the far corner of the cage, becoming Street Ginger once more. But there was nowhere to run. The yowl repeated, long and desperate. It was one of the new, unsocialized cats who had apparently just survived a night terror. But for Barak, it was a reminder. You are still in prison. The morning incident shook him. Even the name he had gained couldn't completely erase the instincts forged on the street. Stella came in the morning. She noticed how Barak, usually sitting by the bars, was huddled under the bedding. "Oh, Barak," she said, quietly shaking her head. "Did that night screamer scare you?" She took a small, fluffy ball on an elastic string from her pocket and, for the first time without fear, slipped her hand through the open feeding hatch. She didn't try to grab or pet him. She just slowly moved the ball across the floor. Barak, though frightened, couldn't resist. The name Barak demanded curiosity. He slowly extended a paw and tentatively nudged the ball. Stella laughed. "See? You're not a savage. You're just a cat." She spoke to him as an ordinary house pet, and these words and this relationship, which he had been denied in his first months, now worked like therapy. Stella started using his name. "Barak is waiting for you. Barak, don't be naughty. Barak is sweet today." The name transformed from a sound into recognition. It became his identity. A week after gaining his name, Barak was transferred. "Quarantine's lifted," Stella announced to Owen when he came in on Wednesday. "We're moving him to the communal room. He's shown social skills." Owen lit up with pride. "Barak, did you hear that?" Barak was moved to a large, spacious room where the cats could roam freely. Gone was the solitary steel chamber where every corner was an enemy. It became a huge, bright space with climbing perches, toys, and other cats who behaved completely differently than Regal. They were calm, domesticated, simply waiting. Barak, accustomed to aggression, didn't know how to act at first. He expected a fight, but received only an indifferent glance from a fluffy Persian cat sleeping on the highest shelf. In the room, he met Sonia. Sonia was a senior volunteer, a woman in her 50s with warm, quick hands. Her job consisted of touching and talking. Sonia approached him when he was sitting on the floor in the corner, feeling lonely in this huge fake world. "Oh, what a handsome Barak we have! A ginger one!" "That's good luck," she said. Her voice was drawn out and affectionate. Barak felt her warm, slightly rough fingers touch his back. He tensed. The memory of Regal's blow, the storage man's sharp kick, the rough hands that grabbed him for the shot, all resurfaced. He felt the dryness in his mouth instantly return, and his tail muscles twitched, ready to run. But Sonia's hand didn't grab, didn't hit. She just stroked him, slowly, rhythmically, from his neck to the base of his tail. It was the first touch that didn't carry pain. The warmth of her palm penetrated his fur, touching his spine. The growl that had been ready to erupt in his throat died. He felt the rising tension in his chest begin to slowly, painfully recede. His body resisted, but his mind, momentarily freed by his name, saw no threat. Sonia continued to stroke him. Barak, without realizing how it was happening, began to push his head under her hand, demanding more. In response, he heard a low, vibrating rumble. It came from his own throat. Purring. Purring was a sound he had only heard from his mother, a sound he, the wild cat, had long forgotten. He couldn't control it. It was his body's reaction to acceptance. Sonia smiled. "See, Barak? You're just Barak, not a street cat." Soon, everyone started using his name. "Barak is waiting for you," they would tell Owen. When potential adopters came, Stella would lead them to his area and say, "And this is our Barak. He's a little wild, but very devoted if he loves you." Barak. The name became a key. It opened the doors to acceptance and affection. He learned to sleep without waking up at every sound. He learned to accept the food placed before him. He even learned to rub against Owen's legs when he came in. Every day, he took a tiny, painful step from wild Ginger to domestic Barak. But he was still waiting. Waiting not just for affection in the shelter, but for his real home, one that wouldn't collapse from human indifference. Hope is a thin, fragile thread. Barak's internal state over the past months had changed from pure, wild fear to cautious, warming hope. He had learned to recognize the sound of Owen's footsteps among hundreds of others. He knew his scent, fresh, young, smelling of school clothes and a bit of tuna. Barak was no longer a creature that lived by instinct. He was a creature that lived by expectation. He sat on the highest shelf in the communal room, watching the door. Owen was now coming in on more days than just Wednesdays. He came to sit, to pet him, to talk about his grades or how unfairly a goal was scored in his last soccer match. All these sounds, which held no direct meaning for Barak, formed one large, comforting picture. You are not alone. But one day, Owen didn't come alone. Two people stood next to him, a woman and a man, his parents. Barak instantly picked up the familial scent, but he also caught something else. Tension. It was a familiar human tension that always preceded major changes. Barak's heart, which had forgotten how to pound in panic, began to beat heavily and quickly. Stella, seeing the parents, immediately looked nervous but smiled. "Hello, Victoria and Robert. Did Owen tell you everything?" "He told us everything, Stella," replied Victoria, Owen's mother. Her voice sounded dry. "He's been talking about this cat for a month straight. We came to look and make a decision." They approached the communal room. Barak, sitting up high, looked down at them. He saw Owen nervously fiddling with the edge of his hoodie. "This is Barak," Owen said quietly, walking over to the perch where the cat sat. "He's very smart, and he's not wild at all, like they said. He was just waiting." Owen's father, Robert, a tall man with a mustache, was skeptical. "Owen, this is a wild street cat. You know what problems we have with Grandma's allergies? And do you remember how our old cat, Whiskers, ran away?" "This one won't run away," Owen exclaimed passionately. "He chose me. I found his name, Barak. A name that's given is a promise. He's not just a cat, Dad. He's a second chance." Barak felt the power in Owen's voice. His name, Barak, sounded like a gunshot, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Owen's mother walked closer. She saw the cat on the shelf slowly stand up when he heard his name. "Stella, is he really affectionate?" she asked, turning to the volunteer. "He's affectionate with Owen," Stella answered honestly. "We wouldn't recommend him for a family with small children, but Owen is his person. He hugged someone for the first time in his life. We've been calling him Barak for a week now." Barak slowly climbed down from the shelf. He walked to the mesh and rubbed his head against the bars, not looking at the parents, but looking only at Owen. It was a demonstration. I am here because of him. The parents left. Barrack felt Owen's despair. He came in on Wednesday alone. He sat on his usual square of floor. "They said they're going to think about it, Barrack," Owen whispered. For the first time, he didn't pet him. He just sat with his head down. Barrack understood. Everything depended on the decision of those two. He felt his hope, his thin, fragile thread, about to snap. He couldn't speak, but he could act. He slowly slipped out of the room and walked down the corridor. He approached Owen. He didn't rub or ask for food. He simply sat down next to him, placing his head on Owen's knee. He was heavy, warm, real. "Barrack!" Owen lifted his head, and his tear-filled eyes met the cat's eyes. "You don't have to do this. You're scared." Barrack knew that in this moment he was breaking all his street rules. To be next to a human when they are sad is absolute vulnerability. But he had to show them. He chooses. An hour later, Stella came. She looked at Owen and the cat sitting together in the quiet corridor. "Well, what can I tell you, Owen? They just called." She paused, and Barrack's heart seemed to stop. "They said yes." Silence. Then Owen jumped up. He hugged Stella. Then he hugged Barrack, pressing him against his ginger, warm side. "Barrack, we're going home." Stella handed Owen the adoption papers. There, in the line for name, the word Barrack was neatly written. Signing the documents was a formality, but for Barrack it was the highest act of recognition. Now his name was official. He was Barrack, and he belonged. Owen carried him in the familiar old carrier, but now it was lined with soft bedding that smelled of Owen's house, not fear. The blanket wasn't draped over him. Barrack lay calmly. He looked out at the world through the mesh, and that world seemed completely different. He felt every foot of the journey, every vibration of the car. It was a long but not frightening trip. He was no longer the found street cat. He was Barrack, going home. When the carrier was brought into the bright, warm entryway, Barrack smelled a sharp, strong scent, the smell of safety. It smelled of cleanliness, food, and most importantly, Owen. He didn't have to search for a hiding place, didn't have to hide. For the first time in his life, he didn't just get a second chance to survive, he got a second chance to live. Peace. That was the feeling Barrack had never experienced. On the street, it would have meant death. In the shelter, a temporary truce. Here, in his new home, peace was tangible, warm. It smelled of fresh wood, warm bread, and Owen. He sat on the floor in the middle of the living room. All around him were no cages, no dirty concrete, no snarling rivals. There were soft, plush carpets. The light didn't sting his eyes, and there was silence. The street cat, in whom the wild memory still lived, waited for a blow, a shout, or the need to run. But nothing happened. Instead, he heard a quiet, measured conversation. Owen, sitting on the floor, stroked his back. "You know, Dad, Stella said that when Barrack and I started working together, she knew right away he was mine," Owen said. His father, Robert, stood leaning against the doorframe. He wasn't angry, but thoughtful. "Stella called me, Owen, not to ask for the cat, but to tell me that you had started smiling for the first time in 3 years. Robert sighed and walked closer, cautiously sitting on the couch. Barrack instinctively flattened himself against the carpet, but Owen's hand on his back kept him grounded. "We couldn't refuse you, not because of the cat, but because of you," Robert continued. "When you were in that accident 2 years ago, do you remember how you withdrew? How you stopped talking to us? How you were diagnosed with anxiety? We tried to find a way to bring you back. Sports, clubs, therapists. Barrack heard the tone in Robert's voice. It was warm, confessional. The cat didn't understand the words, but he understood their weight. "Why was I allowed to open his cage?" Owen asked, finally asking the question that had plagued him since the beginning. "Because Stella saw how you worked," Robert replied, looking at Barrack. "You came to her and said you felt a connection to this cat. Barrack, wild and traumatized, and you, anxious and withdrawn. You were both, as she put it, locked in the same cage. He was locked in metal, and you were locked in your fears. Stella, by the way, isn't just some volunteer. She's an old friend of ours, since college. We just didn't tell you. She was keeping an eye on you. She saw that by saving him, you were saving yourself. This was therapy, Owen. An aggressive animal is the best test of patience and responsibility. When she allowed you to open the door, she gave you a chance not only to bond with the cat, but to open your own door." Owen was silent. He looked at Barrack. The cat was purring softly under his hand. "That's why we gave you 2 months," Victoria, his mother, said, entering the room. "We gave you a chance, and you didn't fail. You didn't miss a single Wednesday. You didn't give up." Barrack, fully relaxed for the first time, stretched. He turned his head and looked at the woman, Victoria. The tension he had seen in the shelter was gone from her face. There was a soft, proud smile. She took a step. Owen tensed. "Mom, be careful." "It's okay," Victoria replied. She bent down and very slowly, so as not to startle the cat, reached out her hand. She didn't stroke him. She just touched the tip of her finger to his ginger crown. Barrack felt this strange new scent penetrate his fur. It was a smell that was now part of his home. He didn't hiss, he didn't run, he just looked at her, trying to understand this new act of acceptance. "Now you're ours, Barrack," she whispered. Robert approached from behind, chuckling softly, and brought a large, soft blanket. He carefully, as if Barrack were made of crystal, covered him with the blanket, leaving his head uncovered. Warmth instantly enveloped him. Barrack felt his eyelids grow heavy. He was surrounded by scents, voices, and touches that were only for him. Not for Regal, not for the neighbor in the cage, only for Barrack. He curled up in a ball. The purring he had recently rediscovered intensified, filling the room with a low, rumbling sound. He felt his name, Barrack, resonate with this sound. Barrack fell asleep. He didn't wake up at every rustle. He didn't need to control the space. He slept because he knew that if anything happened, Owen was nearby. The past life no longer existed. Did he become tame? No. He still flinched at loud, sudden noises and preferred to sleep on the highest shelf of the bookcase. But he was no longer wild. Wildness remained a part of his past, like the scar on his side. Now his world was built on new rules. Trust doesn't kill, touch heals, and a name is a symbol of belonging. He woke up in the middle of the night. The room was quiet. He climbed out from under the blanket and went to explore his new world. The carpet was soft under his paws. He found the bowl of food that Owen had placed in the corner and the litter box. He curled up at the foot of Owen's bed and rested his head on the warm wool fabric. He closed his eyes. In the darkness, serenity, and warmth, Barrack found his home. And Owen, having found a responsibility, found his way out of his own cage. The circle was complete.